Hello and welcome to this video on moss. Moss is an often neglected element of bonsai. It's treated as nothing more than a slightly more difficult to maintain top dressing, like pebbles or rocks. This attitude belittles the rather impressive thing that is the world of moss. Moss is often essential for the illusion of age in some trees. It can be an important feature of forest plantings. It also provides a certain amount of moisture retention, similar to the use of mulch in gardens. Within the wider area of life, and particularly the tree of life, moss has a taxonomic definition and division of Bryophyta. That's the same area where you find a number of other non-vascular flowering plants. Moss is notable for being generally a dark green clumpy thing. It develops in a mat, and this generally is in areas that are covered by shade most of the time. A single plant often has a few leaves, and these leaves are only a single cell thick compared to what you might find in a tree, which is several cells thick. These very tiny leaves of a sort effectively imitate a tree in that they can be attached to a stem, which is then in turn attached to a branch. Unlike a tree, in which the leaves provide a place for photosynthesis and trees conduct the necessary nutrients and water, branches play no such role in moss. They neither move water nor nutrients. Moss falls into two major categories. For the purposes of this video, simply knowing their names is adequate, these being Acrocarpus and Pleurocarpus. One grows vertically, and the other is relatively horizontal. Unlike trees and most other plants, moss is non-vascular. That means, unlike say a tree where it has cambium, there is no system to move fluid around. Most of them are only a few millimeters in height, between 10 and 20, that's a couple of centimeters, less than an inch in most cases. This allows them to absorb water and nutrients primarily through their leaves. This, along with carbon monoxide and sunlight, allows them to then photosynthesize. This nearly all moves simply via diffusion. This means they don't need the same vascular system. Unlike a tree, or in fact most other plants, moss doesn't require a seed to propagate. It's more akin to a fungi in that it has spores, and the spores are what allow it to propagate. Unlike most life forms you might be familiar with, moss is not diploid, meaning it has two sets of chromosomes like a human does. Rather, they are more like the human gametes. They have a single set of chromosomes. That is, until they're in the reproductive stage, known as the Sporophyte Stage. But this is not where they spend most of their time. Most of the time is spent in a state where they have that single set of chromosomes. This is not the only weird thing about moss when it comes to reproduction. Its overarching life cycle is also unusual. The spores it produces create a sort of filament, let's say. This filament is what starts the whole process of more moss growing. This can occur anywhere that the spore lands, whether that is soil, trees, or even concrete, an environment that should be considered inhospitable to any other kind of plant. The only requirement is that the surface is at least marginally stable. From this initial filament grows what is the next stage, known as the gametophore. That is a different thing again, almost like an evolution. This particular structure begins to differentiate and turn into the stems and leaves of the moss plant. A single piece of this filament can develop into several gametophore shoots. These can then result in the moss growing very quickly. That's why it only takes a very small amount when you're placing it on your bonsai for the surface to become covered in moss. Despite what we've said, and while moss can asexually reproduce, it can also sexually reproduce. From the gametophore stems, that is this initial growth from the initial filament, it can begin developing female organs. These are called archaeogonia. They're protected by leaves that help to prevent foreign things from getting in there. They are small, almost vase-shaped structures. They have an open top, and in here, sperm enter. The males of the moss species have an organ known as an antheridia. This is effectively the moss penis and where the sperm comes from. This particular structure puts out the sperm, and this then enters various structures which allow it to be transported to neighboring stalks. These neighboring stalks contain the female sex organ. This allows for a degree of sexual reproduction among moss. It's particularly facilitated by falling water droplets. Different species of moss are either asexual or sexual in their reproduction. It's noteworthy that if we're talking about sexual reproductive moss, that each of these are carried by different gametophytes. That is, once the moss spore has settled and turned into a gametophore, it'll either be a male or a female. There are instances where moss can have the both male and female structures contained in the same gametophore. Another interesting phenomena when we talk about the sperm of moss is that they are described as biflagellate. That is, they have two tails or flagella that allow them to move around. This is useful, for example, when it rains. The rain droplet hits the location where the sperm is kept, called a splash cup. The splash cup then allows the sperm to be thrown a long distance, often measured in tens of centimeters at a time. This allows them to go quite a long way and allow them to keep traveling a short distance once they arrive at the female sex structure of the moss. If you thought human sperm had it hard, consider what moss is going through. Other than the weird sex life that is the moss, they have some bizarre things in the way they actually get nutrition. We've mentioned that they don't have a vascular system, and that most of what's happening is happening in a very local area, but moss is so small that that doesn't really matter. Over the entire plant, they have highly absorbent surfaces. This allows things to move in and out as required. More often than not, it moves in. The key thing that it needs is moisture and minerals. Most of these can be obtained from the outside environment and often only at the surface level. Moss can often get enough nutrition simply from the amount of moisture coming out of the air when it rains and from the ground. The latter phenomena occurs because of something known as capillary action. This is the water will bind to the structures of the moss and are drawn up from it. This means they're brought up the outside of the plant, not through any vascular action, but through molecular attraction. This allows the moss to cover itself in enough water that the entire plant is completely nourished and given enough moisture at all times. If the moss is still struggling somewhat, it is able to move the water and minerals it needs into all parts of the moss plant, either through the cells or between cells. If you're looking to try and grow moss and you are struggling, there are a few things you can do to try and make it happen a little more effectively. The first is that moss in general likes both moisture and an acidic environment. This means you need to have a fair amount of water present and bring the pH down just a little bit. Neutral is somewhere around 7. If you can get it down to 5 or somewhere towards that point, you'll have a better chance of growing your moss. It also likes to be in shade. Unlike most other plants, moss doesn't like direct sunlight. It can use direct sunlight for photosynthesis, but the cost to that is that it generally winds up being quite a dry place. This is obviously not good for a plant that likes being kept moist. Moss doesn't have any true roots. Instead, it has those sorts of filament structures we mentioned earlier. These can be very easily damaged by sunlight and by a lack of moisture. Finally, you may have seen moss used in some gardens, primarily as an effective replacement for grass. This works extremely well, but it can be very quickly outcompeted when it comes to weeds, or in some cases, even your own bonsai trees. You need to make sure that there's enough moisture present for the moss and the tree. Hopefully this has given you some idea about what moss is and how, despite how readily accepted and known it is in bonsai, how much people might in fact be taking it for granted. Moss has a lot more going for it than what we've said here, but this video is intended to give you a broad understanding that there is a lot more to moss than meets the eye. It's a really unusual plant, or group of plants more accurately, and what they do and how they do it is really weird. The way they have developed or evolved over time so that they can get away with the minimum of possible functionality and yet still be an effective and widespread species is, if nothing else, impressive and surprising. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.